So now you're going to hear a little bit from me, just a little bit about what has EDICa done overall before we get down to each work stream. I am in the recovery stage of some disgusting upper respiratory infections. So if I start coughing, I promise you I'm not contagious anymore, but if it does bother anybody, I will wear a mask. So I'm the Principal Investigator at EDICa. I'm also the Director of the Centre for the Transformation of Work at Heriot-Watt, which is a fairly newly formed research centre looking more widely about how do we make work more inclusive and accessible, and what does work mean in people's lives. Alongside all of that, I'm also the local branch president of UCU, and I'm very committed to the EDI work that we're doing through the union as well. So I have a number of hats on when I do EDI work. Most of you know this, you've probably seen me do some version of this, but I wanted to kind of start off with what is the EDI Caucus. So I said we're funded by UKRI with additional support from British Academy. And what we've aimed to do since our start, so we started January time 2023, I think. Yes, time was blurred a bit. Was to identify an evidence base for inclusive careers across the UK's research and innovation ecosystems. So not just for academics, not just for researchers, but for everybody who's involved in the research process. To identify barriers and remove those barriers experienced by marginalised groups. And it's not just about helping people access a career, it's about helping people thrive in that career as well. We're interdisciplinary, so we have a mixture of social sciences, humanities, and engineers predominantly, and we work across a number of institutions, and not just academic institutions either. So we have the Autonomy Institute who are online today and are chairing the online panels. And what we've aimed to do is create national and international communities of practice. So we've done this through stakeholder engagement groups, we're doing this through the flexible fund holders as well. But the key for us really is evidence base. Because as you're probably all aware, there's a growing kind of EDI industry, and often the recommendations that people give are not necessarily evidence-based. And co-design is key to everything that we do. So the proposal was co-designed, the corpus has been co-designed, and we're continuing to code. You're going to do some co-design today about what the future of the caucus is. So it's really led by people with experience of marginalisation and oppression across the research and innovation ecosystem. So you will meet most of these people in one form or another today. This is the senior leadership team of EDICa. So we have Robert MacIntosh over here. We've got James Richards over here as Workstream lead. Jemina is the deputy PI and also the EDI lead. Catherine is our engagement lead. Clay McGill is our neurodiversity champion, and who hopefully will be around at some point today. We've got Lizzie in the back, who's project manager. Most of you will have heard from either Lizzie or Fenella multiple times, probably over your interaction with the caucus. And we've got Freddie. I saw Freddie a minute ago. There's Freddie, who's our finance manager, but has also been helping with organising today. And then we've got Fenella at the back as well. Today, I think, is also a way of us saying thank you to everybody for their support of the caucus over the last 3 years. And what I'm hoping today is that you can enjoy today as well. It's not going to be PowerPoint all day. There's lots of interactive sessions. You should have fidget toys. Feel free to use them at any point. And like I said, if you need a break or you want to go and explore the campus or anything like that, please come and go over the day. And hopefully you'll have a little bit of fun. And hopefully as many of you as possible get to experience the virtual reality. So I wanted to also note our postdoctoral research associates, who we would also not be here without today. So we've got Kiara outside, okay, helping people come in, Joss, Dong, Siddhartha, and Steffi. And we've also been joined by Beth today, who has an incredible story. Beth joined us as an intern in 2023, and is still with us. We've not let Beth go, and Beth has actually just joined Heriot-Watt on a 4-year contract to support the research centre. So I don't know what you did in a past life, Beth, to deserve being stuck with us for this long, but Beth's been a really important part of EDICa as well. The number of our co-investigators are here today. So we've got Nima, Nima's over here. Jason's not able to join us today. Matta, Diane, Marion, the Autonomy Institute, Rafaela, and Nile. So some of those people are online today, some of them just couldn't make it today. So we're quite a big team. And we've also got a number of partners, most of whom are in the room today as well. So please do get to know each other. Obviously, you've all had the chance to indicate whether or not you want to speak to people. Apparently I was not allowed to put myself down as red and have nobody talk to me today. So I'm green, so just please keep a little bit of an eye. And if you change your mind during the day and you started off as a green and then you're an amber or you're a red or the other way around, just please put another sticker over the top. Please don't feel compelled to network, because I know networking can be a fairly painful experience. So EDICa is structured over 3 work streams. I lead Workstream 1, which is looking at the career lifecycle. Robert leads Workstream 2, which is looking at the research process. And then James leads Workstream 3, which is looking at the organisation of work. So these are each of these has got multiple projects within it. Workstream 1 has predominantly looked at menstrual health in the research innovation ecosystem. And as I'm going to talk to you about later on today, that's kind of spun out beyond research innovation as well, particularly with the Employment Rights Bill coming online. Robert has been leading a number of projects with Don and Steffi around things like peer review, demand management, how do we create evidence-based effective diversity training as well. And then James has been working with Joss and Siddhartha, looking at the impact of COVID on EDI and the research innovation ecosystem. We're going to give you more details about this, but also co-designing our fantastic virtual reality. And I'm really delighted that we have Anna Mershon here today who helped us, or did all the design work, and will be here to help anybody who wants to have a go at the VR. So this work is ongoing. All the way through, we've engaged in co-design. We have an advisory board as well. Some of the people in the advisory board are here as well. They've been part of that co-design. And we've got I was trying to work out how many people we've spoken to over the course of the caucus, and I've not been able to. I just know that it's several thousand, and I kind of gave up counting at that point. So we've spoken to a vast array of people working in different kinds of roles, different kinds of organisations. We've been engaging with industry, policymakers, other governmental bodies and employers. So we're trying to look at the ecosystem, the different components of it, and where some of the issues might be around EDI. The other important thing that we've been doing is looking at what don't we measure. So what does the Equality Act not enable us to look at? For example, what data have we collected, but what data isn't being collected? Because sometimes what you don't talk about is even more important than the things you do talk about. And one of the things I want to talk to you about today over the course of the day is it's become very clear to us that there are some very deeply entrenched norms across the sector in terms of what makes a good researcher. And this is something that Steve mentioned, DISC, which is Disability Inclusive Science Careers, but I've been researching academic labour for quite a long time. And over the course of that, it's become apparent that what institutions' policies might be, the rhetoric just does not match the lived experience of people working in research. And that's going to be my major provocation for people today, is around how do we challenge these really deeply entrenched embedded norms that we probably all are part of reproducing one way or another. And we've also undertaken a number of other additional projects. We've done more work with UKRI. So James had a project looking at the PGR terms and conditions. And we had another project looking at global talent visas. We've got Disability Inclusive Careers in Engineering, which is funded through Impact Acceleration Funding, and Beth has been a key part of that with Fenella. And we've also been doing work with the Intellectual Property Office, looking at the barriers that might be faced by disabled and neurodivergent people trying to secure intellectual property rights for their research. So EDICa has grown and it continues to grow, and we really appreciate everybody that has worked with us and obviously funded us over that time frame. So the reason I wanted to kind of set another standard for us is that we're driven by the social model of disability. Can I ask how many people in the room, at least, are familiar with the social model of disability? Okay, so most of the hands are rising. Some of them are because I've talked about it for years now at them. Others are because this is what you do. I can see some thumbs going up, which is great. And I think it might become apparent over the day why that's the lens that I really see a lot of the work that we've done through, even if it's not about disability. So the social model of disability would argue that people are not disabled by their quote-unquote impairments, they're disabled by their environment. So for us, that would be our working environment. So that can be policies, it can be the physical environment, it can be social attitudes and cultural barriers. And the reason I want you to think about the work we've done through that lens is it moves the focus away from fixing the individual towards fixing a harmful and damaging working environment. We're not interested in training people to cope with harmful working environments. And unfortunately, that is some well-being, for example, is an agenda we see across a range of employers. Quite often the well-being agenda is, we're going to treat you really badly, but here's some mindfulness exercises on how to cope with that. And we might offer you some yoga in the car park at lunchtime. By using the social model of disability for everything, we're taking the focus away from the harmed person towards the harmful environment that is causing them harm. So even if we're not looking at disability, so you're not disabled if you get periods, but you might face disabling barriers if you menstruate in a working environment that's designed by and for people who do not menstruate. So what I'm encouraging people to think of is shift the attention away from the individual towards what are we doing? What is our environment? What are our attitudes? Because the attitudes, unspoken policies that exist in employers are probably just as powerful, if not more powerful, than the written policies that we're supposed to adhere to. So this is the ideal researcher. This probably isn't everything. And I used to try and say everything without taking a breath, and I can't do it anymore, and I certainly can't do it today. This is not in policy. It's not written down, but it is what guides people's experiences of working as a researcher. Now, obviously, some of this might be more discipline specific, some of it is less discipline specific, but these pressures are increasing as we see increasing financial pressure on the sector. The pressure to meet all of these norms is increasing as well. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is something that I have put together over about 8 or 9 years interviewing academics and researchers and people working in professional services roles about what makes the ideal researcher. No one is this. There is not one human being that is this, but it's a guiding norm. It acts as a way of controlling who is included and who is excluded. The closer you can be to this, the more likely you are to be successful. So it does not need to use a toilet. That's up there because so many participants have said to me things like they were taking their students on a field trip, someone else booked a coach without a toilet, but it was a 3-hour journey to get to the place. Or another thing that I've heard is like a kind of competition for how long can you go without going to the toilet, which is not that. We've also been told that another thing that people do is how long can they go without washing, which I also find quite unpleasant. I guess if you all smell, then it probably doesn't matter that much. But these are the kind of norms that people have to adhere to. And if you don't, then you're seen as other in the system. Right. Falling behind on my slides, so if you just look at seconds. So I think at this point, we now move on to, it says here we move on to Steve McLaughlin, but he's been and gone. So we now move on to the first panel, which is me, James and Robert. You need to come and sit on this side because otherwise the camera won't pick you up for Zoom. Am I driving the slides? Up to you. Okay. Right. Okay, we're ready to move on. Yeah. Right. So I led Workstream 1 with Chiara and Dawn, who I think they're still helping people find their way in. And we were looking at the career life cycle. And the example we looked at for the relationship between life and work was menstrual health. And what we were interested in is what is the relationship between working as a researcher and managing menstrual health? So more widely than menopause, because a lot of employers were focusing on menopause at the time, but also looking at what's the lived reality between being an embodied researcher, so having a body that becomes visible, in the research and innovation ecosystem, but also about very different working environments. So getting your period working in an office is very different from getting your period working in the Amazon, for example, or in the North Pole or on an oil rig. And this has sort of turned out to be really timely because the Employment Rights Bill was coming through with, as you probably know, employers of over 250 people will have to have a menopause action plan. And we've actually been involved in taking the evidence from EDICa to help try and inform these menopause action plans. So what we've been doing is we undertook a lot of interviews. Nima helps a lot with the data collection with that, and Joss, I think, is nipping in and out as well. And also interviews with deaf researchers, and we think it's probably the first study looking at deaf women's experiences of menstruation in the workplace. So what we really wanted to do was look at this from the point of view of people with lived experience from different perspectives, so making sure we had a diverse sample, including neurodivergent women. And we used that to co-design interventions across a range of research sites. Some of you are here today. I won't name you because you might want to be confidential, but some of you are here today. And each research site co-designed with us a bespoke intervention. So for some organisations that might have been menopause action plans, it could have been menstrual health champions, it could have been making sure menstrual products are available in field kit, etc. And what we've really seen through that is that the intervention actually began from the moment we asked people to start talking about what their experiences were of managing menstruation. So Chiara, who's now joined us at the back of the room, designed a survey which I think took off more than we were expecting it to in organisations. So within about a week and a half, we had 800 responses or something like that in one organisation. So because people had never been asked about their periods before, and what people were saying was just doing the survey, they then felt they could go back to their manager and say, actually, this is a problem that I didn't know was something I could talk about. Now, that's quite a provocation to intervention research, because intervention research normally would argue that research in the field is really organised and neat, and interventions start on the day you say, right, today's the day we start the intervention. And I think Diane Guy's in the room somewhere, I can't see Diane. Yeah, Diane was my line manager when I was a postdoc, and it was something we found in that project as well, that when you start asking people to reflect on their working environment, they start to make changes to their working environment, so the intervention actually starts then. What we also discovered is a lot of employers are relying on extremely poor evidence bases for their menstrual health plans, and sometimes this could actually be quite damaging. So they're bringing in organisations that deliver training that could be about giving people nutrition advice or exercise advice, etc. So the focus is very much on the individual. But by speaking to gynecologists, they're saying to us that people are having recommendations made to them that are not medications they should be taking, are not interventions they should be having. So employers are starting to notice this, and it was a key, I suppose, recruiter for us to say this will be evidence-based and it will be tailored to your organisation and the needs that you have and the specific needs of the researchers that you've got. But what we would also argue is it needs to be part of a wider discussion about the embodied work of being a researcher. So, we're talking about women's health. We need to see that in the context of significant cuts to women's health during the pandemic, very little research into women's health. So it needs to be seen as kind of wider of a part of our ecosystem. But it also opens up discussions for men to talk about the role that their body may have in their jobs. It opens up opportunities for people to talk about things like continence issues that they may not have been able to do before. So, as I said, I'm going to give you provocations, or I must have learned this word recently and I'm using it all the time, but provocations through the day. And what I want to start off with is saying that what we can't do, if we really are committed to creating equitable working environments, we can't engage in interventions that actually just reinforce the status quo. So if we want menstrual-friendly workplaces, telling people what diet they should be following reinforces the discriminatory practices that you have in your workplace. And we have to try and avoid interventions that nibble away at the edges, that ultimately reveal the fact that workplaces are quite discriminatory. But we also need joined up thinking. So employers are filling a gap that is being left by the NHS in the UK. They're providing occupational health assessments, they're providing these kind of trainings, etc. Quite often they don't follow up on that training. Has it been effective? But they've ticked the box. Yeah, we've trained all of our managers about autism. We've trained all of our managers about menopause. But when you say, and what impact did it have? They don't know, because they've ticked the box and they've moved on to the next initiative. We would argue the Employment Rights Bill doesn't go far enough, and we can talk about that later. But we would also argue that we need government level intervention to ensure that healthcare is meeting the needs of women, that we address healthcare deserts for women, so they're part of Scotland with no menopause specialists, for example, that employers need to be part of an ecosystem of change across the sector. And that's it for me, and then I pass on to Robert, I think, and I'm driving the slides.
Am I going to stand here?
You should, that should get you, I think, Robert. I don't think you need to move. Is the microphone picking Robert up?
Good. Good morning, folks. It's lovely to see you. My name's Robert MacIntosh. For 8 years of my life, I worked here at Heriot-Watt University, but I now work at the University of the West of Scotland. And I had a slightly out-of-body experience driving back to a place where I spent a lot of time. I'm going to start just by picking up two things that have come up in the conversation thus far about the nature of the caucus and the work. The first is that last week at the University of the West of Scotland, we had the relatively newly appointed Scottish Government Minister for Higher Education and Further Education, Ben McPherson, visit our campus to see some of our students and see some of our programmes. And the point that I really made to him, which I think is often lost in policymakers and politicians who have responsibility for higher education, is quite what a big ask society has of universities as employers. So Kate's just mentioned the fact that universities are plugging gaps, as lots of other organisations are in relation to NHS provision. And if you think about all of that responsibility for the people that we employ in universities, and then multiply that by the many, many more people that we are responsible for their education or their research career as research students, it's a huge responsibility, which is frankly under-resourced and misunderstood, but absolutely seen as the university's problem when anything goes wrong. So I think there's a real jeopardy about that for our sector as a whole. We play this hugely important role in society. It's not that well understood how complicated that landscape is. And in that context, I think the caucus has done some great work. And the second introductory remark that I want to make is about the messiness of the research process in this area. So again, Kate was referring to the fact that the intervention starts when you begin to think about it, not when you press go on some control experiment where you've got two universities, one of which you've done helpful things to and one of which you've not done helpful things to. Life is not like that. My PhD and training was in engineering before I ran away to the social sciences, but I'm a really passionate advocate of action research, and in particular participatory action research. Organisations and social systems do not lend themselves to clinical control trial methods. And the caucus has really evidenced that in the way that we have gone about our work. So those are two background things before I come to Workstream 2. And as we come to Workstream 2, I wanted to just acknowledge that the caucus has also been, I think, an outstanding example of hybrid working. And so it's really lovely to see three-dimensional people where mostly I've seen two-dimensional people. I want to pick out three individuals, the postdocs, including Kat Morgan, who was on the programme at the beginning of the programme and it's no longer working in the caucus, but Steffi Schneider and Dong Lin, I see Dong in the room, for the two postdocs. So when we talk about what has Workstream 2 done, it's really what have we done collectively, not what have I done. Much more their work than mine. And secondly, really lovely to see Siobhan and Matt, but not Joe Parslow, who've been three of the most active members of our stakeholder panel. And it's been really brilliant to hear that input and third-party perspective on our work. So this is what we've been doing in the second work stream of the process, which looks at the career context in which research and innovation happens, and in particular has taken a focus on the impact, the pernicious impact, I would say, of peer review, which lives in this space where there's a tension between trying to fund the best research and best ideas to push the best science or social science or humanities research, and do so equitably and fairly, but also do so inclusively, and that's hugely challenging. And so we have started to work with an evidence review, which if you are new to the caucus or haven't come across it, I highly recommend. It's on the EDICa website, and it looked at what's been written and known about the process of peer review thus far, and where were the hotspots, where there are there's lots of studies, and where are the colder spots, where not only in some cases are there no studies, nobody's even asked the question to frame a study. And then in that context, what we've done is try to gather data to build an evidence base around what we know and don't know about peer review. And to do that, we have been using in particular a method called video diaries, where we try to catch lived experience of people in various roles in that peer review process as it's happening. It's much like the messiness of participatory action research starting when you begin to think about it, not on the day the study starts. When you're doing work of this sort, which is time pressured and often in parallel to other responsibilities that you have, your opportunity to remember that, oh, I wasn't entirely comfortable with that part of that decision process is not 3 months later in some interview, it's the day you've done the work. So we're trying to use video diaries as a time-efficient, distributed, asynchronous method of allowing actors in the situation to reflect on their own experience. It's a method I've used elsewhere in strategy research with really great effect. It's a method we found hugely problematic, mostly because of the voluntary nature of the work, the sense in which this is sensitive and therefore maybe not that comfortable, and the time pressure. But what we've done is gather data from each stage of the research funding cycle, from talking to people who are commissioning research, so funders as they think about what is it that we actually want to do here, to the administrative teams that then support that research and begin to configure the bid or the call, or to the people who are appointed as panel chairs, and that's a responsibility I've had a few times in the last few years. They're brought into that process to oversee the way in which the funding will be dispensed, to the people that we ask to review those bids, and they're often dispersed across multiple institutions, so each bid is looked at by a few independent sets of eyes and rated and ranked, to the members of the panel who then gather those reviews in and look at them and usually establish some kind of rank order of things that are more likely to be funded and things less likely to be funded, to the participants who have put forward the bid and the kinds of feedback that they get at the end of that. And what I would say about our conclusions as we look across those areas is that we are developing guidelines in 4 areas, as you can see on the screen, based on the insights that we have gathered about how to do this difficult, sensitive, actually largely hidden from view work better. So we're looking at work in the space of peer review of funding. We're looking at this phrase which gets used a lot in the higher education sector of demand management, and that's where a funder is so overwhelmed by the number of potential bids that they get that they ask the institution to say, you can put forward 1 or 2 bids in this space, maybe for a fellowship or for a centre or something of that sort. So the institution itself has to introduce its own internal mini assessment process of which of the 5 or 10 people who've said they'd like to go for this fellowship will we support. So that demand management process. And then the caucus, as with several other bigger funding calls in the UK system, has introduced this notion of a flexible fund where some of the money that we received, we were then to dispense to other researchers. And so we've developed guidance in that space. And finally, just to pick up the other piece of work that we've been doing, to try and make EDI training more impactful in the research and innovation ecosystem, our work has really looked at the experience of people going through EDI training, and we've created a network of 32 champions from across research and innovation settings, many in higher education, but many also not in higher education, that have their experience of how did they get on in training sessions which were online on a range of topics that they helped self-select, so they were interested in. And what makes that training more interesting, more impactful, enables them to be a better champion for change in their own organisations. So that's what we've been doing. And to go on to the next slide, please. I guess our challenge to the community and those online and in the room, I would regard as the kind of leading edge of that community, because you're here, because you're interested. My challenge is a bit like Kate's challenge, that we don't nibble at the edges, but that we actually think, how do we personally take some responsibility for making a difference in a system which is systemic and problematic? And it could be that you say, well, I'm going to nag the funder to behave better, do more impressive things, be more inclusive. And that's a good thing. I would encourage us to do that to our funders. We have nagged you throughout this process and will continue to do so. We can nag regulators and universities, but in actual fact, change is both top down and bottom up. And my challenge to each of us is there anything that we could do within the confines of how things are currently organised to make more equitable and inclusive outcomes come to pass? And I'll give you one small example of that. It is pretty clear when you're running any kind of funding process that you can be overwhelmed by the number of applicants, and therefore giving really high quality feedback is challenging. And you could say, well, I'm going to nag the funder to pay for more time in order to do more feedback in order to be more inclusive. And that's a good thing to do. And if that works, whoopee. But it might not work, and it might definitely won't work instantly. So every time you're engaged in peer review, you can think, what could I do to make available to those who were unsuccessful better quality feedback? And it might just be that you agree to run a half-hour Zoom session in which you say, I was one of the reviewers, and here are the 2 or 3 things that seem to mark out applications that did better and applications that did worse. That's not personalised, tailored feedback to every individual applicant, but it's a hell of a lot better than a note that says, thanks for your application, it was a no. Oh, don't ask me, because I got 3,000 of them, I have no time to tell you. So the extent to which we can take some personal responsibility for trying to change the practices is very like that participatory action research ethos of saying the messiness of the research and the inquiry and the attention to change starts when you start thinking about it, not when you finally have an announcement of a funding call from a funder, which is better resourced, more thoughtful, and just idealised. We might eventually work towards that, but we're much more likely to work towards it from the bottom up than we are from the top down. Thank you, Keith.
Okay, over to you, James.
Okay. Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Kate. So I've been introduced already, but just to refresh memory, my name's James Richards. I'm effectively I'm a co-investigator on EDICa, but more importantly, I am the principal investigator for Workstream 3, which is called the organisation of work. And just looking around here this morning, there's plenty of people here who've got some awareness of it. So give me for going over some of the things that many people in here perhaps already know. I think Kate and Robert would agree in the sense that we could speak at great length about what we've done and what we've tackled, and what we're also thinking about are things that need to be further looked at quite some length, but this is just a kind of a summary. So hopefully it does the work stream some kind of justice. So first of all, I just want to kind of mention that one of the key things that was looked at related to flexible fund, not flexible fund three, what I'm talking about. I think I've lost track of my notes. No, I've got to do the right way around.
Workstream 3.
Workstream 3. Okay, so no, I'll lose sight of that. I'm not sure where I was going with that now. Anyway, the point being is that what we've looked at, and it's been mentioned already with Kate's introduction, is that a key area that we've looked at is what has been the impact of the COVID pandemic on EDI in the research and innovation ecosystem, and kind of linked in with that to a point, but also separate to a point as well. We've also tried to kind of think about how what can we do to make workplaces more accessible. That's effectively the 2 main parts of Workstream 3. And just the nature of the term organisation of work, at least implicitly, lends itself very much to, as Kate has mentioned already, or at least in one sense, the social model of disability. What we're talking about here is how can research and innovation organisations, at the very least, recognise the kind of things that they're doing that are causing problems related to EDI, but also as well, how can we kind of show the way in some particular sense? You hopefully you'll already be aware of, spotted it, and be keen to test it out. But we've got 2 stations where people can test out the virtual reality initiative and toolkit that we've been developing. And just to kind of give you a heads up in what sense, this is the first time that we've really tested it out. Don't get me wrong, but this has gone through a very long and detailed process. Joss and Siddhartha have been leading on this, and Lizzie as well has been a key actor. We've got Dan as well, of course, who's been mentioned from the organisation who's put all this together, and Immersion. So we strongly recommend that people will give us some feedback on this. It's been through a long process. It's mentioned already how EDICa is built on the principles of co-design as well. It has been a process that is very much has co-design deeply embedded in it, and then we've gone through a very long process of testing it out and getting feedback from a range of people, not least the people who are likely to benefit from this. So just to kind of give that a heads up, I just wanted to kind of make sure and really encourage people to do this. I think the sessions last for about 10 or 15 minutes, and the most that we expect from you after that, and still it's not a mandatory requirement. We would like you to kind of tell us what you felt useful about it. We know with everything there's bound to be some kind of limitations with it, so we're not looking for weaknesses per se. If you want to show them with us, then please do. But this is just the start, and as Kate said, EDICa will run into next year as well. And one of the big parts of what we plan to do with EDICa next year is to try and kind of roadshow, in a sense, the virtual reality. And we also would like to take this work further, much further than we managed to get it to at this stage. So another thing that we would like you to consider doing as well, give us some ideas about where you think this could be extended to, what kind of different working environments or particular groups or anything that comes to mind. All information that you provide will be, greatly appreciated. So, and I think there's a range of post-it notes to kind of do that. So if you think of something an hour after you've looked at it and you want to go back in, just fill in a note and stick it on the wall where this is all being organised from. So, I mean, a key issue really relates to what we've been looking at, and this is not exclusive to Workstream 3 by any means at all, is that I think we all know that this is a critical time for EDI. In one sense, the pandemic seems 5 minutes ago, but it was more than 5 years ago when it started, and I think it's reasonable to say there was an air of optimism at the time, in one sense related to EDI. Working from home doesn't cure everything related to EDI, but it's certainly a substantial movement in the right direction. And I think a lot of people consider that to be a kind of a major lost opportunity. And now, 5 years on, we've obviously got an administration at the other side of the Atlantic, and we've got plenty of people discussing here. So EDI is very much under pressure, and I think what our task in many ways has intensified, in the sense that there's never been more of a time to really make sure that what we do and what we find gets shared widely. So your input and your part of this, in one sense, of course, is to kind of help get that message out there. But coming back to the idea of what this work stream really is about, what we're talking about here is that we need to change organisations. That's not just like an ideological way in which to consider this. My main area is employment relations or industrial relations or employee relations. These are the terms that it comes under human resource management. And a lot of this is about power dynamics in the workplace, how relations work between employers and employees, or senior managers and regular rank and file employees. And employees and managers are not homogeneous groups. So EDI is very much part of this, and in order to change how workplaces are, there needs to be a very fundamental cultural shift in how organisations are run. If we were here perhaps 40 or 50 years ago, and you were talking about, we need to speak to the workforce about a change or something that we need to improve, that would not be the most revelatory kind of situation, let's say. But in 2025, it seems odd, and I think far too many people at all levels of the organisation have become conditioned over several decades and now several generations that somehow employees' interests or their voices can somehow be dealt with by human resource practitioners. That's not a massive criticism of HR, but I think as HR has grown over the last 3 or 4 decades, we've not really seen any kind of movement or anything substantial related to EDI. So I've wondered a little bit off what I was actually thinking about, what I wanted to say today, and just to kind of go back to the kind of things that we have done and very much relate to what EDICa is all about. The kind of things that we really looked at, I've told you what were the kind of questions we're trying to at least broadly answer. We've done a range of surveys. We've got one currently in operation, which it relates to bullying and sexual harassment. That's effectively a follow-up survey to the survey that ran about 2 to 3 years ago. And hopefully, if we can get that out again at some point in the next few days, anybody in the room can distribute that through the network. It would really be appreciated, and a whole range of ways in which to kind of disseminate information. We've got Siddhartha in the room who's finishing another report that we've come from this. Those are all really important. I'll say some more about them in the next slide when we move on to what are some of the finer key issues that need to be addressed and how we might begin to start addressing them. But I think in one sense, the jewel in the crown of Workstream 3, I think without any question, is the virtual reality. Obviously, I'm kind of hedging my bets on that because, you know, the proof will be in the pudding, because this will be the first kind of way in which we get some strong and meaningful and broad-ranging feedback. So again, just to kind of put that, a virtual reality account of enabling workplace. You know, it's really about, you know, what does enabling office space look like, where a lot of people in innovation will work at some point, of course. And then we've got a lab. It's only one particular lab. You know, we would like to have gone further than that. We did initially try to think about how we could perhaps do something that involved some kind of field site as well, which is a very important part of research and innovation, and certainly kind of covers on the kind of exclusionary kind of things that Kate was mentioning before about administration, etc., and things like that. So yeah, so that's what that's the kind of broad overview. If we move on to the second slide, please. So yeah, this slide is just broadly divided between the kind of key issues and some of the recommendations. I said before, you know, there's a lot more to this. This is really kind of getting things started in one particular sense. And I think one of the messages here, you know, take it all together in one sense, is that what needs to be done is not necessarily precisely about improving things on the lines of EDI. A lot of the things that probably would change and benefit EDI, and therefore overcoming, in a sense, the politics of, you know, certain groups perceived to have certain privileges, etc., the organisation, when the reality is quite the opposite and has been for a long time, is just generally consider how work is organised in terms of job satisfaction and the work environment. You can kind of make some changes there. You can improve job satisfaction. You can improve the working environment, the way that people work. You're going to, by automatically, in one sense, make the workforce more enabling and inclusive. And then you can then consider about the finer points, etc., things like that. So some of the key issues that we did uncover, there was that, not surprisingly, I don't think that's kind of, a lot of people would find that entirely surprising. It's obviously the data that we actually have that relates to different groups that we're interested in that probably reveals more. You know, general job satisfaction was not great, but certainly for a range of groups, people disabled, deaf, neurodivergent, etc., their experience was notably inferior compared to that kind of general not great picture. Don't get me wrong, there were still some good areas of encouragement in that particular area across all groups, not least on things such as like the ability to work flexibly and working from home, you know, more often than not. But I think we'll all be aware that this is something that's quite controversial and has been for quite some time, and universities and other kind of similar organisations are not affected it are not immune in the sense that there's been a kind of, let's roll back on a lot of these issues. And I don't think a lot of consideration has been of what the effect that may be. And kind of blanket policies that come to the office, etc., things like that. And it's only really when you've got like a good sector or departmental manager who kind of pushes back on that, or at least says, you know, let's kind of think this through and make sure that my team or my area isn't as affected by that. So other things that kind of came up as well were just kind of common dissatisfaction with EDI initiatives. Again, nothing particularly surprising there. But again, reflecting this idea that, you know, the pandemic, which was a disaster, of course, for many people, a lot of vulnerable people, was a revolution in one sense in terms of what employers were willing to do. And it's quite evident that employees could, if they wanted to or were compelled to. And that's one of the kind of aspects of this work stream that we're moving towards. I think one of the fundamental things that, in a sense, my provocation is that, you know, there has to be some way we can come up with new and innovative practices that allow inclusion, because the world moves on, technology and the way work changes. But some of the things that block EDI are far more deep-rooted and structural. And I think they've kind of solidified in the last few decades. Concentrations of power, influence and decision-making, and a kind of retraction from kind of more traditional forms of industrial relations, which were by no means ideal, don't get me wrong, but the notion that you are compelled, or that it's the norm, to speak to your staff about change, speak to staff about new policies, practices, etc. And most of all, you listen to them when they've got grievances or they've got issues that, you know, are not being addressed by the organisation. The chances are, if they were listened to meaningfully, they would be able to, some change could be enacted. So clearly that's become more fragmented and nuanced over the last few decades. We're not just talking about people about terms and conditions of employment and pay, which remain critical, of course. We've had a long period of downward pressure on pay particularly in the university education sector. But we certainly need to have more forms of, I would call that pluralism, in the sense that we need to speak to people who work here and who experience things and understand their lived experiences, and their ideas and viewpoints need to meaningfully be fed up and brought and factored into decision making. Decision making should be, in many ways, evolved in a range of ways, etc. So a couple of the things that kind of came up prominently, or things that we kind of factored in and decided were going to be really important. This was part of co-design right way back, probably at the beginning of 2023, around about that time, where we were first starting off as well. Trying to hear about, you know, I think it was parents at the time anyway, anecdotally at the very least, that, you know, that the NHS and current provision is being under stress for quite some time in the UK. Austerity stretching out over the best part of 2 decades now has taken its toll in that area. So in one sense, this is not an area that organisations can necessarily deal with directly, but there is far more scope and latitude for them to kind of accommodate, in some sense, or work around these limitations, etc. Even if it's just as simple as, you know, think about disability leave, for example, which is a form of kind of absence, if you like, but it's not registered and certainly doesn't count towards people's performance. I think probably has. And just kind of finishing with the 4th point in one particular sense about bullying and sexual harassment. When we were kind of co-designing this research, a lot of people seem to be thinking that bullying and sexual harassment had gone up during the pandemic, and that was a kind of something we wanted to explore, not necessarily test in a, you know, like a traditional kind of hypothesis, kind of positive way to do research. Just wanted to really explore it, and we've also further explored that related to interviewed focus groups, and there's a qualitative angle to the survey. But one of the things that we did find, and something that's one of the reasons why we're repeating the bullying and sexual harassment survey, is that once we came out of the lockdowns, if you like, from around about 2022 onwards, bullying and sexual harassment began to rise, and there seems to be no real particularly direct explanation for why that may be. But whatever the case may be, it does fits in with the broader narrative and reality that many organisations have just lost the focus on EDI coming out of the pandemic, focused on strategic imperatives. EDI has always struggled to get a seat at the table, and it's struggled to, even more so since then, and just generally a lack of tactics and practices within organisations that really can tackle these things. So just to kind of end with some of the kind of recommendations, and again, these are quite broad ranging, and I've kind of touched on them already to a certain extent, so I won't labour the point. I have done in a range of ways so far. I'm advocating for a stakeholder approach. What I'm meaning by that in old language of industrial employment relations is organisations becoming more pluralistic, power structures being more devolved, sharing of power. Sometimes the old adage used to be 30, 40 years ago that in order to maintain power, you should share power in some particular sense. So we're talking about sharing power, which in some sense is quite an abstract thing, but in a very simple way, certainly related to EDI, is speak to the people. If you're developing a policy on neurodiversity, speak to people in your organisation, or speak to people who represent such people and ask them their opinions when you're designing a lab, designing a building, anything that you're doing in terms of new in your organisation, rather than getting that, assuming it, or worst of all, in one sense, as Kate's kind of touched on already, is that assume that the best way in which to deal with these is to try and find some way in which to change the individual in that process. Have people co-design to a certain extent the buildings, the labs, etc. That we use, and I think it's Catherine who's done a lot of research in this area here in the next session. And it was something that Catherine said. I suspect it wasn't Catherine's actual research that revealed that maybe it wasn't. Forgive me for that. Is that the cost of retrofitting is substantially higher than if you don't do it in the first instance. So speak to your people. If you're in these conversations, you're heading off potentially so many different problems in the future. So I'll just finish by saying, enabling workplaces requires some kind of cooperation, and I think this very much kind of like an old way in which to think about how workplaces probably worked a lot more commonly going back several decades. Co-creation is just another term, as far as I'm concerned, or broadly synonymous with just being pluralistic, and employers accepting that, they don't know everything, they can't do everything, and there's this resource and they need to work with them rather than kind of assume what they want and do it in a particular way that suits the organisation rather than suits particular people who would like to benefit from this. And ultimately, key issue here, and I can't think one of the problems with organisations is that many of the initiatives in organisations related to EDI are not co-designed, not based on evidence, and these are the very things that you can.
Thank you very much. So that's the end of us talking. We do have time for questions. Are there questions on Slido? What do I need to do? Right. Okay. Ooh, interesting first question. Can everybody hear me okay? Nodding, okay. Okay. Right, so first question. Hello, and thank you for the webinar. You're very welcome. My question is, given all the needs, challenges of working with human embodied researchers, isn't AI the ideal researcher? So I asked ChatGPT, who was Professor Kate Zhang? And it didn't know who I was, and I was very offended. It found a Kate Zhang who worked at a different university, so it was me, so it couldn't get the basics right. So I also asked, is Kate Zhang a nice person? And it said she looks it. So the first one was wrong, but the second one was clearly correct. I'm going to open it up to the panel because I have a personal view on this. And the Autonomy Institute are using AI in terms of forms of data analysis, but is the ideal researcher artificial intelligence?
Do you want to go first? Does that microphone like Peter?
I think that one in front of you should be live, and the weird box should be as well.
Undoubtedly, artificial intelligence is going to change the way in which we do research, but I don't think it is the same thing as a researcher. And we are not at a stage yet where quantum computing, which is the thing that they predict will take AI to a level where it gets to super intelligence, is in place. So for the immediate and foreseeable short term, I think the answer is definitively no. But there are things that artificial intelligence and digital solutions can enable for colleagues who have restrictions in terms of mobility or access or healthcare or caring responsibilities that I don't think we utilise nearly as much as we could and should. To pick up a point that James made, the pandemic was a large-scale social experiment which showed us that huge swathes of the economy, including most of higher education, could function at least reasonably effectively entirely digitally. And I don't think we've retained enough of that optimistic, entrepreneurial, pioneering spirit as we step back into the way in which we operate now.
James?
Can I say that I'm completely ignorant in lots of ways related to AI? I am, let's say, behind the curve in terms of incorporating that into my own personal day-to-day life, not just working life. So I'm not so sure how I could comment on it in that particular sense, but answering the question, but in a different way, maybe one way in which to think of is that perhaps the person who's had the time to explore AI and to train and to have that extra time over the last few years, and certainly of late, to get an idea of how it can help and shape, and no doubt it will be able to do that in some sense. That would be another thing to add to your very good depiction of what the AI work is. Somebody's got the time and inclination, because I think many of us, no doubt, probably everybody is time poor, idea rich, let's say. It's a question of having the opportunity to really explore that. I expect I probably just avoided it, but yeah, I don't know if that helps, but I would say that's a big aspect of it.
Okay, so then another question is, can people use the ideal researcher image with acknowledgement? Yes, you may. So there we go. And then the next question is for you, James. So thinking about the VR Roadshow, are there any particular groups that you want to engage with this? Who needs to experience it to help you achieve your wider aims? So before we get to that, I just wanted to say, if you want to try the VR, but you don't fancy wearing the headset because it's going to make you feel a bit pukey, because it can have that effect on some people, we're going to cast it as well, so you can watch someone else on the headset. So James, who are we looking to roadshow the VR with?
Okay, I think the simple answer follows very much on what I was kind of just saying in the previous slides about the idea that in order to really shift things or begin to shift things up is to consider some kind of stakeholder and pluralist approach. So everybody who has got some kind of input into how organizations and workplaces are designed should test this out. Or so clearly people who would benefit from EDI initiatives would be in there, of course, but we would also want people who perhaps have the privilege of commissioning and designing and organizing the process around, refurbishing and building new offices or new workplaces. And I think we also had our Steve McLaughlin, our guest introductory representative from Heriot-Watt today. Our executive, for example, not necessarily specifically our executive at Heriot-Watt, but people who make decisions should be able to see this, and I think the key advantage of this, and it's obvious, is that it's so good to have everything. It's quite visual, and it's a way in which to kind of get a quick understanding and a very good understanding of what important differences can make to people. And again, look at it one more time, please have a look. So yeah, everybody who is involved It may not be people who necessarily benefit from it, but people who can make decisions, or people who it's their responsibility in this area. And just to add one further point about that is that, as I've mentioned already, we're looking to show it in 2026. So if you as an representative of an organisation would like to experience this and bring it to your organisation and a group of workers or a group of people or decision makers you would like to see, then please get in touch with EDICa after today, and we'll do what we can. We'd love to show it, and any ideas who would benefit from seeing it as well.
We love a road trip, so if you want us to come somewhere nice as well, that's always better. Yes. But no, we've got a budget to come and bring the headsets to you to show it to you. So I'm going to aim to finish at 10 past to give us 5 minutes between the sessions to allow people to move around and maybe have a comfort break. So if we don't get to the questions all now, we're keeping record of them, and we can come back to them later. And there is something in the chat on Zoom saying that Slido's not working for everybody, so please, oh, there we go, it's working, great. So many EDI researchers are burnt out. How do we change this in the immediate time frame? And the reason I wanted to ask this one is because I think it relates to a bit of what Robert was talking about, that I think one of the things that we see is when an institution is struggling or in a crisis mode, the first thing it gets rid of is EDI. And so we had a number of equity champions whose job roles changed, for example, or they'd had redundancies, and so their workload had increased, and then the equity champion training became harder for them to justify prioritising their time for. And that's before you get on to the fact that probably most of us that do this kind of research come from the groups of people that we are trying to change the world for, but certainly the world of work. And yes, people do get burnt out. And how do we change this in the immediate time frame? I mean, this is probably Robert and I might have different views on this. I would say that trade unions are really important to this. We have to work collectively. Individuals cannot change the system. I think we have to push back on employers who will, say, announce a big redundancy program and then give people a time management training session to go to, or some mindfulness training. I think there is also something about these communities of practice. And one thing I noticed with the flexible fund holders and the equity champions is they were offering mutual aid to each other, whether it's sharing of resources, a listening ear. So we have to work collectively, but none of us can do this on our own. We shouldn't be doing it on our own. So my view on that is we have to look after each other. And if you need to take a break from EDI for a while, it's okay. You're not letting anybody down if you look after yourself. You cannot do any of this if you're not well and you're not able to look after yourself. If you need to take time off sick from work, then you need to take time off sick from work, and don't use it to write a journal paper or a grant application. If you need to take your annual leave, take your annual leave. It's not a gift from the employer, it's because they need you to take it. So that's it's not a straightforward answer, but don't be an island, I suppose, and reach out to people for help. And we quite often get emails from people just asking us for help, and we do the best that we can. But it might be about referring people to other resources. Recognise that we're not the only experts. There are people working in charities, etc., that can offer help, support groups. The learned societies can do quite a bit, professional bodies can do quite a bit. So I'm going to take the privilege of being chair to say that I'm going to stop the questions now, but although we're going to wipe Slido, we're going to look at the questions before they go, just to give people about 5 minutes to move around the room a little bit and get the next panel going. So before we go on to that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, everybody online as well, and to all of our speakers so far. So we've got 5 minutes before the next session starts. Okay, thank you very much.